We can have the resume, we can have the background and experience, we can even work extremely hard. But if we don't know how work really works, we might not reach our goals or the level of influence or impact we desire. Today, we are talking about the informal subtleties that make all the difference for us to elevate our impact, our engagement, job satisfaction, regardless of your role. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live. Well, you could be with us for future episodes live on your favorite social media channel. You can find out about when those will take place and how you can participate by, and therefore obviously seeing them sooner, because this isn't going to go live on the podcast for about 6 weeks. So you could get a jump if you do join us live. You can find out about how to do that on our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. This episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Masterclasses, picked from 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become more effective, productive, and confident while overcoming some of a leader's toughest challenges. You can learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. Today's episode, before I bring in my guest, I want to tell you that a couple of weeks after this podcast goes live, in the middle of December, so about the end of the year, we're going to give away a copy of this book, Michelle's book. And I will introduce her in a second. And to get a copy of this book, you need to send me a note on LinkedIn. You need to go to LinkedIn and say, Kevin, I'd like to be entered in the drawing to win the book. And if you do that about the end of the year, you might get a New Year's gift. And so with that, let me bring in our guest. Whoops. There she is. Her name is Dr. Michelle King. Let me introduce her to you, and then we will dive in. Dr. Michelle King is a globally recognized expert on inequality and organizational culture. Based on over a decade's worth of research, Michelle believes that we need to learn how workplaces work so that we can help make them work for everyone. She's the host of the popular podcast called The Fix. She's the author of 2 books, The Fix, Overcoming the Invisible Barriers That Holding Women Back at Work, and her latest book, the one you might have a chance to win, called How Work Works, The Subtle Science of Getting Ahead Without Losing Yourself, which was recently released, and it is the focus of our conversation today. As well as being a researcher and author, she's also a speaker and the founder of The Culture Practice, a global consultancy that provides leaders with the assessment, development, and inclusion coaching needed to build cultures that value difference. She is our guest. She is here. Michelle, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you, Kevin. It's such a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
The first of 3 podcast interviews you're doing today, you told me. Your story is obviously longer than the bio that I shared with you. And so I'm guessing that you didn't wake up when you were in primary school thinking, I'm going to write books about inequality and organizational culture. So tell us a little bit about the journey that leads you to this point. In short, just give us a little background, a little context.
Well, actually, I did grow up thinking I would do something about inequality because I grew up in South Africa during apartheid. And I was there when Mandela got released. I was there during apartheid. And as a white South African, really having to grapple with inequality, seeing inequality everywhere, and recognizing the role that white people like me, myself, and everyone I know has played in upholding a system of inequality. I think from a young age, the difference in South Africa from other countries that I've worked in and lived in is you can't deny it. It's literally right there, right? Like we're talking 1996, which was when Mandela was released. So I think people have to recognize in many ways that sets South Africans apart because inequality is just core to their experience. And so for me, my journey actually began as a researcher wanting to understand how inequality works because you just see so many efforts to try and solve it, and yet it's still a problem that exists in workplaces. And given that next to sleeping, work's where we spend the most number of hours over our lifetime, it seems kind of crazy to me that we haven't built workplaces that really do work for everybody, that value everybody. And so I set out to try and solve that problem. But, I had an experience even as a kid with recognizing the critical role that all of us play in dismantling inequality. I was a waitress at a coffee shop in South Africa, and I was young. I was sort of 16 years old. And F.W. de Klerk, who was the former president of South Africa, white male for people who don't know the story, and he was the decision maker around releasing Mandela from prison. For years, right, his entire career was building, maintaining, upholding a system of inequality. And he decided to dismantle it and, potentially put himself at risk. And I've always been fascinated by that. Now, whatever you think his motivation was for doing that, I think we actually need more people, to dismantle systems that they benefit from. So even at 16, I knew the enormity of that moment of meeting him. It was right around the time Mandela.
Well, he was in your restaurant.
He was in our restaurant. So he walked in with his wife, all his bodyguards, and I was nervous with my pen, couldn't write anything. And so I said to him, could I please have your autograph? Because I just thought, be great to have that. And then I said, do you have any advice? Now, I've always been a little bit weird, a little bit curious, even as a teenager. And he turned to me and he said, yes, always remember to keep the conversation going, no matter how hard it gets. And I think that's what we've lost in all of this work. It's the ability to keep that conversation going. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the US with diversity, equity, and inclusion, the backlash, the fatigue, the just sheer exhaustion with the topic, this feeling of when will this just all go away? When can we get on with real business? I mean, I've heard it all from leaders. And so I think our job is to keep the conversation going, which is why podcasts like this are so important.
So our conversation today relates to all of that, and yet it's really about the book's title, How Work Works. That's where I want to start. This book is really about what you would call the how of work. What do you mean by the how of work?
So just for context for listeners, I am first and foremost a researcher, and you'll see that in a minute because I'll just be given stats and facts. And so I'm not into platitudes. I'm not into self-help. I don't believe in any of that. I like data. I like research. I like really understanding problems from a scientific level. So for me, the how of work, I became fascinated with this topic because at the same time as studying, and I've got 20 years in academia, I've also worked in a range of corporates. And what I found, which most people will have experienced, is you often notice in organizations that no matter how many formal policies they have, people find ways of working around them. And so I started researching the topic of office politics. And a lot of sort of how work gets done is managed informally. We know that, right? That's pretty well established. I think the challenge is recognizing that that's changed. So the 1950s command and control hierarchical world of work, where office politics was the theme, to get ahead, you had to maneuver, backstab, manipulate, cajole people into getting them to do what you wanted. And actually the workplace really only worked for white, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied men. That's changing, and it will change because our context has changed. So, the how of work has to change with it. And I think for me, I wanted to write this book to show people, this informal, unwritten, ambiguous side of working life actually isn't that ambiguous. We can understand it through science. We can come to understand not just what we do, but how do we do that in a way that benefits ourselves and others. And importantly, why do we need to do that in this new way, given the context that we're working in? So that was the goal with the book, is to set out and research it. And boy, did I. There's 15 pages of notes that people can fill their boots with, in terms of having a look at all the sources around, the how of work and how it's changed.
Yeah, and we're going to get to those informal systems, if you will, in a minute. But before we do that, there's another idea that you bring up at the very beginning of the book that is pervasive throughout. And it's the idea of we need to be able to read the air. Now,
Mhm.
there aren't. Last time I looked in the air, there weren't actually letters or symbols in the air. But when you say reading the air, what do you mean? Because I think that sets context for everything else that you and I are going to talk about today.
Yes, so I wanted to give a concept to this idea of the opposite of office politics, if you will. So, being able to understand yourself, understand other people, knowing how to manage your interactions with them in a way that's mutually beneficial. How do you do that? So, in a lot of cultures, people will have different terms for it. They'll call it reading the unwritten rules, reading the room, reading between the lines of what somebody says. But in Japanese culture, the term translates to reading the air. And what I really like about it is in Japanese culture, it is such a core practice in their culture that, people almost take it for granted as the way things work. And a lot
There's
of people,
you even talk about the fact that there's a video game to help
there's
people
a
get better at it.
Nintendo video game that literally helps people think about how they read the air. And I think, there's a great anecdote in the book, which is it's a true story, where a Japanese businessman was in a meeting with a client and he, was kind of running over, it was running a bit long. The client starts commenting on his watch. And so the Japanese businessman looks at his watch and then goes on to tell a whole story about where he bought the watch, right? And the client's getting more and more flustered because in their culture, that's a way of letting him know, hey, you're running over. Have a look at the time. I need this meeting to end. And I think a lot of people might be wondering, well, Michelle, why can't you just be more direct, right? Why can't we just give it to people right between the eyes? What's the whole point of managing our interactions with others, trying to manage the impact our behavior is having? Why is that so important? And my message is because it demonstrates care. It's how we care for each other. And somewhere along the way, it's become uncare to cool about work. So it's uncool to care. It's like somehow caring about work, caring about the meaning we derive from work, caring about our teammates, the contribution we make beyond a sort of list of tasks is not something people are talking about. And you see this with the sort of social media trends around lazy girl jobs or snail girl jobs or quiet quitting, this idea that I'm going to go into work, do the bare minimum, and kind of screw the workplace, And the reality is, we are our workplaces. We are our workplaces. So
We
managing
absolutely are.
the impact our behavior has is absolutely core. And the challenge is in this world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's this belief of I need to be able to go to work and just be myself regardless, right? And for me, I'm sort of like, well, that's how we got into this mess. We got into this mess because white men went to work and only sort of engaged and supported other white men and were like, screw everybody else. And the reality is we have to start caring for one another. Why? Why does this matter? Why is this a business imperative? Because 83% of us have to work with others in order to do our jobs. In the new world of work, collaboration is king. So you cannot afford to not care for the people that you work with. And so I think for me, what I wanted to show through data is that, and quite extensive research, is that you can develop, you can advance, you can connect with people in a way that not only benefits you, but also benefits them. And that actually everything we want, whether it's career advancement, meaning, fulfillment, is on the other side of learning to manage how we work with others.
It's on the other side of that, and it's on the other side of rather than being, well, I really wish someone would, but it's all of what the message of this book to me as a reader, in part is you have responsibility for this. So there are things that we can do as individuals, regardless of our role, right, to help make that happen. And I think being on a podcast for leaders, that applies to us with our own hat on, but it also applies to us in terms of how we think and help our team members as well. That's one of the reasons why I think the book is so useful and so helpful. You talk about 4 informal systems, right? And so the core of the book is around these 4 systems, and then what we can do to manage the informal, if you will. So why don't you just lay out the 4 briefly, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
So we talk about the importance of advanced social and emotional skills. You'll hear so many people say that, right? And I think the challenge is for most people in their jobs, they're wondering, what does that mean for me? So what does it mean for me? What do I actually need to do to be inclusive, to be collaborative? What does that actually look like at work? So that's why I set out to try and understand what is the how of work. And it comes down to four things. The first is informal networks, so who you connect with. That really matters. Again, good example here of how the world of work has changed. So in the 1950s, sort of industrial era, that hierarchical structure, you could afford to network if you were a white male with only other white men, really, because they were in positions of power. That was the dominant group. The challenge is today, if you look at what factors are most predictive of promotions or accessing job opportunities, it is a diversified network. Why? Because 70% of all jobs come through the informal network. And by 2044, at least half the population in the United States is going to be made up of people from typically underrepresented groups. So what you're finding is overall, and there was a 2020 McKinsey study showed this, workplaces are trending on becoming more and more demographically diverse. So what that means is it is almost guaranteed you're going to have to learn to work with people who do not look like you, who do not share your background, and learn to bridge your differences with them. So informal networking, like if you have a network, you cannot afford to only connect with people who look like you. That is a really silly strategy when it comes to your employability. And, I think people have to recognize your employability has changed, right? It's no longer down to sort of a job for life or 2 or 3 jobs for life. You can't rely on your company to think about your career progression. You have to manage that. And one of the strategies for managing that is building a diverse informal network. So the second piece in this is how we share informal information.
Before you go on, there's one of the things I found really interesting in the book, and that's why I looked down for seconds. I wanted to find it real quick, is that you talk about sort of 3 kinds of networks. And I don't know that we need to expand on them necessarily, but I just want to share them. You talk about informal advice network.
I've got a whole network rant, so I don't know if I can come back to networks. But the reason I say that is like there's so much important information I want to share around informal networks, particularly for leaders. So I do want to come back to it. And I think just, the 4 systems really quickly. The second one is how you share informal information to build self and other awareness. The third is how you manage your informal development, because 70% of all learning happens on the job. And finally, it's informal advancement. So in this new world of work, do you know how to manage your career? Most people do not take actions regularly to manage their career. So consequently, you really are at the mercy of your organization. Can't afford to do that anymore. So on informal networks, I think the challenge with informal networks is people often think of it as some sort of weird cocktail hour, where you're going around and shaking hands and handing out your business cards. And that's not it. That's not at all what my research found. An informal network is really made up of people you go to for informal information on how to do your job. So this might be what's going on in the organization, why decisions are made, how to get things approved, like what are the paths to success, right? And then the second piece is around social support. So you might have people you go to at work if you're having a rough day, if you want to talk about sort of a difficult topic, and they offer support. And then the third piece is advice. Now, advice and information are very different. Advice is you have a specific problem and somebody's going to share what you can do to navigate that, versus information is a general understanding. So if you were to list, anybody you go to for those 3 things, that's going to be your informal network. Typically, that's around 12 to 25 people. And I think what we get wrong with networking is we often think that the way to build a network is to think of somebody who you need something from and then to go and connect with them so you can get it, right? That's not
That's
it.
one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons people don't like that networking that you described at the start. Like, I'm supposed to go around and find someone I can sell something to, right? Or sell myself
Exactly.
to, right?
Like people who are actually very good at informal networking are constantly thinking, who do I want to connect with and what can I give them? So it's almost like thinking of it as a bank account, right? Like, who do you connect with and how do you invest up front so that at one point when you might need a withdrawal, you've got the connection in place so you can do it and it doesn't feel gross. So a good example of this is, again, if you look at that list and then think of anybody you'd like to add to that list, my question is, to make those points of connection, how are you offering information, advice, or support? Right? What are you doing to connect with people by doing that? So to give people a quick example, last week or the week before, when my book came out in New York, I had a big meeting with my editors and they said, why don't we organize a lunch, right? So this is a lunch with HarperCollins, like the head of HarperCollins business. I've also got the head of a big PR. Everybody's there, right? And I thought to myself, who's on my informal network list who wants to write a book, who I want to develop a more meaningful connection with, who could benefit from coming to this lunch? And so I reached out to them and said, hey, I've got my book coming out, thought you might benefit from coming to this lunch. We've got some amazing people. Why don't you come along? I don't need anything from them. I'm trying to build a connection with them by giving, right? So it's an entirely different take. And the amazing thing about this is research shows people are hardwired for reciprocity. So they're going to want to give back to you simply because you reached out. And that's what develops a connection. Is it mutually beneficial? Does this person have my best interest at heart? We trust people when we believe that they are acting with our best interest. And that's why giving in order to connect is how you demonstrate you're somebody who does have the other person's best interests at heart.
Which takes us back to where you started in the book and in this conversation, that it requires, it is informed by us caring, right? So yes, all of those things that you said in terms of the dominoes of inviting the perspective or the author, the hopeful author or whatever to this lunch started with you caring enough about them to think about inviting them, right? So it all starts there. And I love that. So
I have more networks, but I don't want to take
I know. We got, here's the thing. We've got 35 minutes. We can't do the whole book. Besides, Michelle, we want them to all get a copy of the book. I'm talking with Dr. Michelle King, the author of How Work Works, The Subtle Science of Getting Ahead Without Losing Yourself. So, Michelle, I'm confident that people who are listening to this are nodding their head. Yeah. But Michelle, I work in a virtual workplace, or Michelle, I work in a hybrid workplace. And some of these people that you want me to network with, I don't even see anymore. I was talking with someone yesterday who leads a team, and she's got 4 people on her team she's never met. She's worked with them for a year and a half. Like, this is harder or different when we're not in the same physical proximity. So the mindset underneath it isn't different, I realize. But give people some specific ideas about how to do this when we're not passing each other in a hallway.
So we have to accept, and this is not popular, but it's factually correct, so I'm moving forward with it, that while most of us want hybrid working, and that includes me, I want it, it is culture eroding. So it's very difficult to connect in a hybrid or virtual setting. It just is. And so if you think about, being on Zoom, right? Or even now, this interview now, you can't see the rest of my context. You can't read my nonverbal cues aside from my face. You don't know what's going on for me outside of just this little screen. You don't know if I'm having a side chat while I'm engaging with you. You don't know if I've got a browser. You don't know any of that, right? And so it makes connection next to impossible. It's very difficult. And so for me, I think anyone who works in a hybrid setting, if you do read the book, recognize that in a hybrid environment, you have to double your efforts. So if we think about networking, right? How do you build an informal network virtually? It's so hard, and it's where companies make things weird with cocktail hours and you name it, right? Trying to get people to connect. And so as a consequence, you have to be much more intentional, which is why I literally set out a series of practical steps people can take. Like, here's how you map your network. Here's how you build your network. So for example, we've just shared like one tiny way in terms of, reciprocity and giving. But in a hybrid setting, you have to be so much more intentional about where you spend your time and how you're taking sort of effort. So for me, it's not to say hybrid has to go, because I actually believe it's here to stay. 70 to 80% of companies say it's here to stay. Even if there's a trend now to move back to the offices, you're still likely to have 1 to 2 days a week where you're not in the office, right? So there's some form of this. But I think recognize it's a lot harder. And as a consequence, you have to be way more intentional. Like the second practice we talk about in the book is information sharing. Well, we know in a hybrid setting, that's way reduced. What's the problem with sharing informal information? You're not going to develop your awareness of yourself, like how people see you, of other people, of what's going on in the organization, because you simply don't have access to that informal information. So as a result, you've got to be way more intentional about who are you going to for information, how are you going to fill that gap, right? So I think for me, hybrid working, you almost need the skill more in that context than you do if you're working in an office.
And I think both of these first two, informal networks and informal information, are places where organizations are struggling with how do we recreate, reform onboarding, right? Because even if we're woefully poor at these two things organizationally, well done onboarding can help with both of these. And that all has to be rethought as well. I really want to spend a little time on the informal development one, because I think that the reality is that a lot of leaders who are watching or listening are at some level, I might be speaking to the choir here. Like, they're choosing to watch, they're choosing to listen, so they're working on their own development. But a lot of leaders I work with are frustrated because their team members kind of want to be spoon-fed. Like, when am I going to get this next certification? When do I get some training? There's no budget for the training. When can I take the training? And the idea of this says information, but I'm going to take it off because it should say informal development. The reality is that we have a responsibility for that in our own development. So talk about that one a little bit, about what can we do, but also what can we as leaders do to help our folks realize their role in their development.
So I think when it comes to informal development, there's a couple of things we get wrong. So one of them is that we think, to your point, our workplaces are going to put us on a training program and that's going to solve it, right? That's not how you learn. It's just not. Like, people hate me saying this. It's true. It's not how you learn. So your recall on like formal training is anywhere from like 6 to 12 weeks max, right? In terms of remembering it. So most learning happens on the job. About 70% of all informal learning happens on the job. And it happens in one of three ways, or a combination of all three. So it happens by observing, right? So you observe, typically you're observing a leader if you're an individual contributor. You're observing the behaviors they engage in. You observe what gets rewarded, endorsed, supported. All of that serves as role modeling, and observing is actually one of the primary ways people learn. The second is feedback. So giving and receiving informal feedback. And the third is trial and error. Now, one of the major challenges with all of this is that employees are following outdated models. So your leaders are not going to like me saying this, 100% true. So if we think about that transactional command and control way of leading, that hierarchical way of leading, that's gone because organizations have become flatter. Only 14% of CEOs believe in that hierarchy, right? Today, like, who you work with is arguably more important than who you work for, because we have to collaborate with others to achieve outcomes. To get ahead, you have to be curious, caring, empathetic, democratic. You have to know how to value differences, right? You've got to do all of that to collaborate with others. And the problem is some of the role models individual contributors are looking at, aren't engaging in the right behaviors themselves. And so I think, the best case for this is if you think of inclusion, how workplaces have become more diverse but less inclusive. One of the reasons for that, or the greatest, most significant contributing factor, is leaders' behavior. 46% of employees' experiences of inclusion are directly attributable to their line leader, which means we have leaders who are not engaging in the right behaviors to create the right environment. So for me, the starting point for leaders is recognizing, what are the behaviors I'm engaging in? Have I just accepted this old way of working because maybe it's worked for me up until this point? Or have I realized how the context has changed, and so I'm going to change my behaviors to be more effective, right? And I think the problem, if you are a leader, and this is probably the most uncomfortable thing I'm going to say, but again, it's true, so just go with me, is that generally in organizations, leaders tend to be the least self-aware people. So the higher up an organization you go, the less self-aware you are. And in
So
fact,
less feedback you get, the less information you have in many ways, which aids in that. And even regardless of whether who is the least self-aware, there are any of us as humans that are very self-aware. All of the research points to that as well.
That, but it is more of a challenge for leaders because, in academia, we call it the CEO disease, because one of the difficulties is you simply have less access to honest feedback from a diverse range of sources, right? And as a result, it's harder for you to know what's the impact your behavior is having. So if you want to sort of fast track this, you have to know, how are you showing up in terms of what you think your behaviors are? How do other people see that? And what do you do to kind of close the gap between the two, right? And I think for a lot of leaders, they just don't know how to do that. So I want your listeners to think about integrating two practices that will not only improve how they're showing up, but arguably will serve as a better role model for people to informally learn from. So the first practice I want people to think about is, one of the studies showed if you just take 15 minutes a day, and you can do this in the shower when you're walking your dog, and simply ask yourself, what worked, what didn't, what could I do differently, right? And have that reflection. Don't go to sort of the why questions. Don't go into like, why did this happen? Why is this good? Just simply stick to what. You will increase your self-awareness by 23% over 10 days. So 15 minutes a day for 10 days, you'll see that jump. Now, somebody might say, well, Michelle, 23%, that's not, enough. What I want to explain to people is you've got to think about the compounded effect over 30 days, right? Imagine if you made that a daily practice. And I promise you, I do this all the time. So what worked, what didn't, what could I do differently? Like, I do about 500 speaking engagements a year. And one of the reasons I've developed the ability to do public speaking in an effective way is because at the end of every talk, I will go around and just say to people informally, hey, what worked? What didn't? What do you think I did? And then I'll reflect on that. So I think the second part of this is not just self-reflection, it's also, as a leader, do not make feedback weird. Don't make it weird. Don't formalize it and have some form, or even your 360s. All of that is through a bias lens. I think what you need to do is think about yourself as a data gatherer. How often are you just informally at the end of a presentation, the end of a meeting, like, hey, what worked, what didn't? What do you think I could do differently? Like, gathering that feedback. And in the book, to help leaders with this, there is a model for how to give and receive feedback that sort of takes it to the next level. But I'm not even asking you to do that. I'm saying just make sure you're asking those what questions to gather data to integrate the two. And it's important with all that lovely reflection that you actually identify something you're going to change. So,
Not enough to just think about it, right? Exactly.
Right. And in the book, just to help leaders, I have actually given the examples of the behaviors that are required in this new world of work. But I think, a starting point might be evaluating yourself against that. So really looking at, hey, am I leading in a way that's aligned to this old world of work that's actually going to prevent me from being an effective leader today? Or am I leading in a way that's, and then, setting on this path of self-discovery to know if what you think is actually true.
There's lots more we could talk about in this book. We've been talking with Michelle King about her new book, How Work Works, The Subtle Science of Getting Ahead Without Losing Yourself. But I've got a couple of other things I want to ask to sort of close us out as we go into the final turn of this conversation, Michelle. And one of those is this: what do you do
No one's ever asked me that. I have two little kids, so I've got a 10-year-old and a 8-year-old, and hanging out with them is a lot of fun. I also run. I don't know if people think that's fun, but for me, that's fun. So I do a lot of long distance running.
Awesome. A member of my team is running a marathon on Sunday. I am not. And the only question you knew I was going to ask you is this. So, Michelle, like me, you're a reader. What are you reading, or what's something you've read recently?
So I'm reading Atomic Habits by James Clear. And it's really sparked sort of a lot of ideas for me on how to weave in new habits into my daily routine. So I think it's a really good book for anyone who's looking to make big changes, but do that in a manageable way.
In small atomic habits. Maybe the question you've wanted me to ask the most, Michelle, is where can people learn more? Where do you want to point people? Where can they get the book? Any of those things? Now's the chance.
Yeah, sure. Please just hop onto my website at michellepking.com. And for anyone who's watching this, I have built a career e-journal you can download that has 52 exercises, one for every week of the year, to help you really try and find greater meaning and fulfillment and advance your career. So it's aligned with all the content in the book. So it's a nice practical way to put that content into action.
michellepking.com, and of course go to wherever you get your books to get a copy of How Work Works. Michelle, thank you so much for being here. We're not quite done, everybody, because you know that if you've been here before, you know I have a question for you, and it's a question that Michelle hinted at a minute ago. We can't just reflect. We can't just take in information, formally or informally. We have to act. So my question for all of you is, as it is every week, now what? What action are you going to take as a result of what you've just heard? Now, you might have been listening to this while you were running, or while you were exercising in some other way, or while you're cooking your dinner, driving, I don't know. But hopefully you found this enjoyable and entertaining. But ultimately, it will only make a difference for you if you take action on something that you learned. You got a number of very tactical, specific things that you could do. We talked about different ways of informal networking beyond the cocktail party model. Maybe one of those is the thing that you need to work on. Maybe you want to think about being a data gatherer, both on yourself through self-reflection and by asking what questions of others. I don't know what it is for you, but I do know that if you answer that question, you will get far more from this than if you don't. Michelle, thanks again for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you and to have the chance to read your book. And now to remind everybody that you have a chance to get a copy, that this exact book that I will send to someone about the end of this year. So if you're watching this or reading this in, I don't know, the middle of 2024, chances are you're not going to get the book. But if you send me a note on LinkedIn, you will get yourself entered to win this copy of this great book. Michelle, thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
And so with that, we will close this episode, knowing that we'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe, invite someone else to join us, or give us a review. You know how to do those things. I'll see you next week.